So with that, I'm going to move us into our next session, which so I'll invite Ed and Doug and Jahan to come on stage. I'll introduce Jahan Benton Clark, who is a principal at Impact Practice Advisors. She was with us here at the foundation for 5 years until her husband got this fabulous job and required them moving to Atlanta. But we keep inviting her back because I want her to remember how much she misses us. So with that, I'm gonna turn it over to Jahan.
Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So the central theme of this week's symposium is around power. And so you all are going to hear lots of different perspectives of individuals and organizations about how they think about power, how power manifests, the challenges around power as a construct, and the importance of power to social change work. And this morning, we want to have a deeper conversation about philanthropy and power. So just to kind of set some grounding for us as we think about power, we think about two notions related to power. One of them being around this notion around power to. So the ability to do something, to make something happen. And then we also have this notion around power over. So when you have control over the actions of others or over the course of events. So as we have this discussion this morning, we're not going to do a traditional question and answer. Each of you have index cards, and there's going to be runners moving around. So if you'll just hold up a question that you have, and they're going to bring them to me on the stage periodically as we are going to integrate them into this conversation that we are having with these leaders and advisors in the philanthropic space this morning. So you all have everyone's bios at your fingertips. So we're not going to do full introductions of this panel. So by way of introductions, I'm going to ask Ed O'Malley, who is the president and CEO of the Kansas Health Foundation, and Karen McNeil-Miller to share a little bit around why a conversation around philanthropy and power.
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here in Colorado, and wherever Alejandro is, he needs to know he's going to be invited to Kansas because we need that energy in Kansas just like we needed it here. That was awesome. Jahan, the why for me is I think we need to make conscious choices, and we shouldn't default to systems of power, to understandings of power that have been in place, and just assume we can make progress on the toughest challenges facing Colorado, Kansas, our communities in that construct of power. We need to make a conscious choice about how power needs to be wielded and what we can do to disrupt current power structures in order to make that happen. So I love the conversation. I'm honored to be a small part of it.
So I think a reason to have a conversation about power and philanthropy is that it's always the elephant in the room anytime there's a funder present. The power to and the perceived and actual power over. So it's time we had this conversation.
So Doug Easterling, you have been an advisor, an evaluator, kind of with the field of philanthropy, both on the inside and outside for the last 31 years. Tell us a little bit about what your understanding is around the relationship between equity, power, and philanthropy.
So I started out at the Colorado Trust 31 years ago, 1992. And at that point, we did not talk a lot about power, equity. It was essentially grant making. The big shift in terms of the Colorado Trust approach at that point was to go from responsive grant making to doing its own initiatives. We did the Colorado Healthy Communities Initiative at that point, and that got us into community-based work, which meant essentially trusting the community as opposed to trusting people inside the foundation to know exactly what to fund. That was something that we learned about, and it sort of challenged a lot of the internal expectations and assumptions of the staff and the board. I think probably the staff even more than the board. And then sort of took us back into a point of the sort of the power coming back inside. During the early 2000s, I did some work with CDC on a task force that was looking at how to evaluate Reach 2010, which was the Racial Equity Initiative. And that was one of the first times that we got into the issue of what does it actually mean for to focus on equity and to focus on power. I lost the train of thought. Ask me another question.
So Karen mentioned earlier in her opening remarks that you wrote an article after researching several foundations around the yin and yang of equity-centered philanthropy. What have you learned about what philanthropy is doing around power?
So starting in about 2005 and 2006, some of the leading edge foundations were beginning to focus on disparities in health and to look at what was beneath the disparities, racial disparities, ethnic disparities. And at that point, the foundations got into, but there were 4 different sort of realms of work that went into becoming an equity-oriented foundation. The first was looking at kind of just the journey that people need to take to actually understand equity, understand where inequities come from, understand their own place in the landscape of inequities. That involved a lot of internal work, trainings. One of the groups we looked at in our study was Vitalist Foundation in Phoenix. The staff and board, when they got into that work, was looking at sort of what's behind the inequity that causes. I'm sorry.
It's okay, good, I'm sorry.
Breathe. What's that? I got this. Thank you. Okay. You guys are great. It's great to be back in Colorado, actually. So the first set of work is going internal, is kind of looking at our own personal assumptions about equity, about disparities, our own experiences, whether or not we've actually kind of come to an understanding, whether we're different, how we're different than the people who've experienced the disparities. The second phase of the work is shifting who we are as a foundation, the staff and the board. Who do we hire? Karen talked about the shifting the board, so it's now 50% people of color, African American. That's a really major shift. The third shift is what's the foundation actually going to do to make a difference in terms of the inequities that happen out in the world, how we're how the foundation is going to, either through its own work, the power it can deploy, or through the grantees that it supports, kind of cause things to disrupt in the system that get to the root causes of disparities. The fourth piece is a more interesting piece, which gets into the yin-yang, which is how we actually deal with organizations. As Karen said, power is the elephant in the room anytime the foundation actually starts a conversation. The foundation has the power to decide who gets the money, who doesn't, and that means the foundation's always able to call the shots. That colors the conversations that the foundation has. In order for the work to go forward, the foundation needs to, on the one hand, be out in front, doing the work that it has the power to do, and on the other hand, be supporting other groups, which means a lot of kind of listening and being responsive. This back and forth between being assertive, out in front, making things happen, and being kind of receptive, responsive, keeping things, sort of staying open to the things we don't know. That's the conversation, and it's sort of up to the foundation and up to program officers to set the tone in the setting so that people feel free to enter into a conversation like that.
Assertive and responsive, both assertive and responsive. So, Karen and Ed, as you think about the paths that your foundations respectively have been on, what stands out for you in Doug sharing what's happening in the field? What's your organization doing?
I loved Doug's article about the yin and the yang, and it gave voice to something that I've been feeling and thinking. And I'm new to the field of philanthropy. I've been in this role for just 11 months, but I've been close to foundations for a long, long time. And I thought Doug's article summarized things so well. I think the challenge, to me, it starts with what are we trying to make progress on? And it's equity. It's to dismantle the inequities that are creating the health disparities. That's how we talk about it at our foundation. And so then it leads us to, well, if that's our purpose, then what role can we play? What's the role of our foundation? And I think it often, when we talk about power, I think often foundations have used too much power, haven't been conscious of the power that they have available to them. They don't understand the power of their role. And it's similar to, I think, a lot of situations of the role of authority. Because foundations have a lot of money, they're often in a role of authority in a system. And just like in your organization, whether it's a nonprofit or a local government or a community coalition, those with formal authority often have more power and often aren't conscious of the power they have, and often aren't conscious of knowing how is using that power helpful and when is it not helpful. And I think the path we've been on at the Kansas Health Foundation is one of trying to acknowledge that often we have to center the power of others and then get very clear about when are the moments, the yang moments from Doug's article, when are the moments where we need to assert our power. And those moments are much fewer, I think, than foundations have historically assumed would be the case.
So a few examples. Our strategy and the areas that we focus on, we had to make a decision, but we made the decision based on what communities all across the state told us were the issues in their communities, were the assets in their communities, and were the barriers to good health in their communities. So our entire strategy, even though the yang, we had to make the decision out of all that we heard, but the genesis was listening to community. And so everything that we're working on came up often, if not almost every time in community. So that's one example. Another example of the yin and yang is we certainly believe that communities are the best at identifying their own assets and the barriers and challenges they face. They're absolutely the best at knowing what they would like to see different in their community. Where we can bring our expertise is often in helping them broaden their options for change. A community may come up with 4 or 5, here are 4 or 5 ideas for how we can address X. Well, because of our experience, our knowledge, and us having been across the state and seeing many communities face an issue, we might be able to come to them with, well, here are 10 other options that you can consider. So now they have more options to consider, and we want them to be able to pick the ones that work best for them. And so there's the yin of listen to community and the yang of bringing our expertise to help community find its path forward.
So often with organized philanthropy, right, we've talked about the power that could be perceived, right, in different ways with different communities around access to resources, how wealth is used, how that wealth was gained. What do you all struggle with when you think about the concept of power and the missions that your organizations have?
I struggle with a lot. I struggle with, are we listening enough? I struggle with, are we listening to the right people? And which means in order to mitigate that, we've got to listen to multitudes of people. So in any community, it's not just the nonprofit I want to hear from, but it's the people that they're serving I want to hear from. I want to talk to the school superintendent. I wanted to see, what do the county commissioners say? What does the mayor believe? What's the Chamber of Commerce got going on? Because all of those form a bigger picture. So I worry about, are we listening? And I worry if we know how to listen for the right things. And I certainly worry that even with when we want to share power or release power, I worry that people really don't believe it, or they believe it but they don't take as much as we believe we're trying to offer.
I think what's on my, I worry about a lot too. And in some ways, the old way of doing philanthropy it seems comfortable. Funding institutions that your foundation had funded for generations feels safe and easy. But what I worry about is, how do we make progress on the thing we're saying is in the middle of all of our thinking? Eliminating the inequities that are creating health disparities. And ultimately, it can't just be about talking about that. We have to be able to show evidence that we're making progress in that direction. And while we know that centering community voice, we know increasing capacity and resources to grassroots organizations on the front lines of racial equity, we know that they are best situated to know what will lead to more progress on racial equity. It's still a massive challenge of an unknown. It feels like the Colorado Health Foundation, which I've been privileged to be close to for a number of years, the Kansas Health Foundation, we know we have to do philanthropy differently, and we're doing our best to figure out what that looks like by sharing power, by engaging in trust-based philanthropy, and so much of it is still unknown. And ultimately, we need to see progress on the issue of equity in our communities, in our state, and holding ourselves accountable to doing our part in that direction is what keeps me up at night.
Can you all share something in your internal operational structure that needed to change so that you could be more responsive to communities? And Doug, for you, what have you observed about other foundations?
So a few of the examples that came up in the study we did, one was the contracting with vendors. One thing that you realize pretty quickly when you're in a foundation is that people rely on their own social circles in terms of picking folks to do meals, to do accounting, to do investments. And so one of the most important things people did to kind of center equity was to crack open who was potentially eligible for contracts. That meant, in some cases, just having wide open RFPs. It also meant just kind of intentionally going out and reaching into sectors that the groups had not reached into. So that was one that I would think of.
I'll give a couple examples. So we had to get out in community. That was not an internal practice, with the exception of going on site visits for a specific grant. But I felt very strongly that to be community responsive, we have to be community not only aware, but community engaged. And so just the notion that program staff, leadership, the board needed to get out in community, see the environment and the context in which our grantees are trying to serve, and see the context in which the community lives and exists. That's important. And one of the second things, I forgot what I was going to say the second one. It'll come to me.
I got a couple quick things that came to mind. One, just kind of from a boring structural standpoint, the way we do our accounting. We say we believe in elevating racial equity, but we've had to change our accounting system so that we can actually show you the money that's going in that direction. And in the past, we couldn't do that. Now we can, and we're excited about that because we should be able to see the amount of our resources going to advance racial equity increase. And if it doesn't, then shame on us, and we'll have to hold ourselves accountable. But now we can tell that story, and it will increase. A couple other things that come to mind, though, related to internal structures. The Colorado Health Foundation, I know, does this as well, but a lot of our grants, the majority of our grants, the vast majority of our dollars are going to multi-year core support of organizations. And that is just so critical, I believe, to create the conditions where partners know that funding is there for years to come for them to do their core operations. An example of something we're thinking about doing, and I have a few board members here, and this is something that we haven't talked about yet as a board, but those multi-year commitments create great comfort for a grantee, for a partner. And as those commitments start to come to an end, the power dynamic is at play again, right? Well, we know from elsewhere that extensions are a way of doing business, right? So the coach of the Denver Nuggets probably got an extension to his contract because of the great season. So they're not going to get to the end of the contract before they talk about renewing it. So one of the ideas we're thinking about, again, a structural dynamic to help shift power is to just offer extensions as the norm to our core partners so that that 3-year grant is always in place. And we're always adding another year as a year comes to an end. So trying to think of other examples that we can do internally to create equity at the center of our work.
I remembered what was the other
Adjust your
example.
microphone, Karen, a little bit.
Pardon?
Adjust your microphone so they can hear you a little bit better.
Okay. For us to work more with community-based, grassroots, BIPOC-led organizations, we had to get to know them. We didn't know them. In large part, 5-6 years ago. So we had to go find them. It wasn't that they were hiding. They were just hadn't been in our purview. So we had to get to know them and have them get to know us in a way that they knew us, in a way that was different than how they knew us from before, which was from a distance.
So there's several questions about your responsibility and the power that you might hold or may have with influencing your peers in their journeys around acknowledging power and working towards equity. So talk a little bit about what that looks like and what you've experienced in trying to influence your peers or what you feel your responsibility is.
Well, this is one of the things I struggle with and worry about, which is how much of that is my job to do. I know it's a responsibility I feel, but how much time I should be devoting to somebody else's agenda and not my agenda, is something I think about and worry about. But we do try to be open and public with everything we're doing, our missteps. We are not afraid to say where we are in our learning journey, what worked, what didn't work, so that other foundations can see that and go, okay, that's where we are now. That's why we're at that point too, and that's why it was so hard to push through. It was hard for them to push through. This is how they came to it. I will certainly work with anyone that comes in, and asks, for any advice or assistance in their work towards equity. But I think as far as the field, we try to share as much as possible. We do a lot of presenting at conferences. But I still struggle with how much of that I have time to do and how much that is for me to do.
Thank you.
So this is something that a number of the foundations we talked to have been trying to do. And I think a lot of it is just being out in front, and there are lots of venues where foundations get together and just sort of hang out. And there's usually an opening for someone to step forward and sort of step into these conversations and put things out there. I think a lot of it is how proactive to be as you do that versus how much to simply just lead through example. And I think to Karen's point, there's the question of if you lead too much, if you appear to be too woke, are you going to turn off some of the folks that you're trying to bring along? And so there's a balance there of how far out to go, how much to bring people along. I think a lot of it is a conversation people have. This is hard work. It is really hard work to kind of figure out the power imbalance. And so just being in conversation with CEOs, talking to each other about the struggle that they're having is one of the most important ways for people to kind of give permission and give space for their peers to go forward.
I will tell you, when, in the spaces that Doug's talking about, that foundations hang out, when you get a bunch of foundation CEOs together, it's conversation usually around equity or moving any agenda usually starts with, how do I get my board to finish the sentence? Or my board won't finish the sentence. And so, a lot of the influencing the field, I think, is, or moving an agenda, is the board you pick, the board that is there to support you in the work and the agenda.
Is this a safe space to think out loud? Okay, I want to think out loud for a minute. And my early career was in politics, so forgive me if you don't like that. But starting in politics, it made me think about who do you need with you, and then you do whatever you need to do to get them with you. If you need a majority vote, you got to get to that majority, and you got to reach them the way they need to be reached. And so what the question makes me think about is, for some peers, some foundations, they care deeply about this. Equity is the goal, right? For some foundations, equity is the goal. For other foundations, they might not be there. And what I've noticed is listening deeply to what is it that they're after. Is it about housing? Is it about early care and education? What have they centered, right? And what Karen pointed out early on today is, I think, right on, that progress on those issues requires equity. It requires the commitment that the Colorado Health Foundation has made, the commitment that I believe our foundation has made. So one of the things that I'm just thinking out loud from it that I've realized I've been doing as I engage with other foundations who maybe aren't as focused on equity, on dismantling the inequities, is helping make the connections between how dismantling the inequities will help make progress on the things that they say they care most about. So equity can be a goal, it's also a strategy, if that makes sense.
So civil rights are backsliding across the country, and this is strongly tied to social justice issues. How is philanthropy interpreting their role around what is now becoming an increasingly polarizing issue? How is philanthropy using their voice?
Well, it's hard to talk about all of philanthropy because of all the political positions that there could be amongst individuals, there's that array amongst foundations as well. So there are, foundations that don't believe that there's an equity issue. There are foundations that don't believe that there are structural issues, that any condition that a person finds themselves in is because of decisions they made or didn't make, or actions they took or didn't take. And so trying to reach a common ground there is hard. So there are, and so I can only speak for the philanthropies that I know that have a similar point of view as the Colorado Health Foundation, that we are persisting, we are being unapologetic, and at the same time, we're trying to find ways to discuss it that are not polarizing. We're trying to find ways to enter into a conversation that will invite people to stay in the conversation and be interested rather than incite the other person to get up and storm off. So, the strategy can't be to call people stupid, ignorant. The strategy can't be to embarrass someone, because I don't know anybody that's ever changed by being called names. I don't know anybody that's ever considered changing from being called a name. I know I wouldn't. So I think the philanthropies that have a similar look get together often, and we talk about staying steadfast in spite of the pushback that we get from other philanthropy, despite the pushback we may get from outside community. Folks try to persist in spite of resistance they may get from their own board. So it's to keep on pushing is, I think, how philanthropy that believes in an equity agenda and racial and social justice. That's how we are responding in reaction to all the pushback.
So philanthropy historically has been dominated by white men. Doug and Ed. Talk to us a little bit, right? We're talking about power, right? We're talking about equity. Tell us a little bit about how you manage and wrestle with your own identities as white men in this work.
Sure, we'll go there. There's not much I can do about it. So when I started out, I was surrounded mostly by white women when I worked at the Colorado Trust, and in general, philanthropy is more female-dominated than male. I've come to value listening, and some of that is through experiences where I intentionally try to put myself in a minority position around people of color because I've got a hell of a lot to learn. That was true of that CDC. There's a task force that was designed to look at new ways to evaluate racial disparity initiatives. There were 25 people on the task force. 3 of us were white. The rest were an assortment of people of different communities of color. Met for 2 years, and I just sort of came out of that as just like, okay, there's a whole other world that I didn't grow up in rural Indiana, in a small white town. So every year I feel like I'm getting a little smarter, a little more humble. One of the key stories that came up was a woman named Nettie Code, who was a civil rights leader in Greensboro. And she was one of the early people who was brought into the board of one of the local health conversion foundations in Greensboro, Cone. One of those people that everybody kind of just had to kind of watch and listen to. I was doing an interview with her at one point for another foundation because she'd been a grantee. And I started asking my questions, and she said, Doug, and I'd known her for about 4 or 5 years at that point, said, you just need to listen. You just need to stop talking and listen and let us tell you what you need to know. And so we just completely gave up the interview protocol at that point. And it was one more experience, and there, every year there are more of these, where I learn what it's like to kind of experience life from a different color. So I don't have an answer to it. It's more of, it's a journey, it's an inquiry, and I feel like I'm getting kind of, in some ways, less smart over time because it's all the things I gave up on.
I think what I would add to that is, I think first and foremost, it's about learning, when to shut up and when to speak up. And I think traditionally, people with my packaging thought they were never supposed to shut up and always supposed to speak up. And my sense is the reality is it's much more about shutting up right now and occasionally speaking up and knowing when my voice is an appropriate voice to be speaking up. And to do that, having been informed by Kansans of color across the state through very intentional listening. But I think that's the biggest way I think about it is knowing when to shut up and when to speak up, and recognizing that we have to renegotiate the percentages that folks like me I think have thought they were supposed to be doing.
Ed and Karen, how do you balance the policy and systems change work your foundation's staff do directly versus organizations in your states and communities that do the work?
Would you read that again, please?
How do you balance the policy and systems change work your foundations do directly versus that you might fund that organizations and community groups do?
Yeah, we're trying to be really thoughtful about this, and Kansas and Colorado have a lot of similarities, and we're really different too. So that we're trying to think about the context of Kansas and how do we make progress on these issues in the political systems that is the state of Kansas and our communities, and trying to be very intentional about when are we leading with our voice versus when are we equipping our partners in the grassroots, on the front lines of working on racial equity to lift up their voice. Our sense is that more often than not, we need to be taking a back seat to the voice of our partners. And we also need to be conscious of those key moments when our voice might be a unique voice that can get into a door or can get into an audience that some of our partners can't get access to or can't get into. So we're trying to be very, very conscious of that. I think it's another dynamic of power, and foundations, if not careful, can almost usurp the good work of the people they're funding, which I think is a massive mistake. And when in doubt, I think we should defer to the voices of our partners and help them claim and utilize their power, and then on occasion step in proudly, firmly, with authority, with our voice, but our senses should be a minority portion of the time, not a majority of the time, as we work in policy and systems change.
Thank you for that question. It is a balancing act. The work that we do, that we lead within the foundation and those that we fund. I think I'm making a true statement. I think I see Kyle over there, that all of the funding we do on the policy advocacy side is issue-based. Whether it's at the state level or the community level, it's issue-based. And our policy work internally for many years took that same tact of we picked a couple of issue areas a year that we would have our agenda around. This year, and I think for the next couple of years, we've switched up our internal practice in that we've focused on the process of policy making under the dome. So what we're trying to do is work with the governor, his cabinet members, and the departments to help them advance their equity agenda and the funding that they do in communities, how to make that more equitable, how to make decisions that are more equitable with equity in mind. So we're kind of working under the dome. And then we've also just added a new position that's government affairs that will not just work at the state level, but we want to also be able to try to help you on the ground influence more policy at a local level.
Karen, you're starting with an example around some of the work outside of money. So, and you talked a little bit earlier about money and mouth. So can you all share what you're doing beyond investing in dollars and how you're using the foundation's voice in order to make change?
Yes, well, that's part of how do we elevate and use our own power. And that part of that is taking a stand, putting a stake in the ground on some issues. It's using our voice to try to advance public discourse, to give people information, the pulse, the opinion research, is to help the policy and advocacy community understand how Coloradans are thinking about issues so that they may adjust and pressure test some of their strategies. Certainly something that has money behind it but isn't necessary to any one organization is some of the capacity building we're doing with direct leadership development, with technical assistance through the Nonprofit Finance Fund and other organizations giving our grantees access to information and resources that can help them improve their practice.
I'd say one other piece that came up in our study, and is certainly true in the field, is the convening role that foundations play, which is ideally with the foundation not laying the agenda on the front end, but sort of from the vantage point recognizing all the different groups that are doing things on a policy space that are kind of coherent and complementary to each other. Bring those folks together for larger conversations and develop a more comprehensive strategy going forward. The foundation then can decide from there what's its role to play and allocate responsibility to other groups to also do kind of complementary work there.
So we've been mostly talking about organized philanthropy, but y'all are people too, right? We're talking about people-powered philanthropy, and everyone in this room is a philanthropist, right? Philanthropy means the love of mankind. So I'm curious about, as you think about using your own power, your own voice, what does that look like for you?
Well, I have to be strategic about when I'm speaking as Karen McNeil Miller, President and CEO of the Colorado Health Foundation, and when I'm speaking as Karen McNeil Miller, mother, or citizen, or female. And that's a delicate balance because of the power the position holds. Most things get ascribed to that I was speaking as CEO, and so that's a delicate balance. So I use that kind of power in the boards that I join, that may be boards that I have, that's irrespective, if that's a word, I don't know if that's a word, of my position.
I'm not sure if this is going to answer your question, but we only have 2 minutes left, and I really want to say it. Is that okay?
Go.
All right. It's about power, and it's about the power of nonprofits who are focused on solutions related to racial equity. I think what you need to know is that my experience is that the power you have with and over even foundations like ours is immense. That when you walk into those meetings, it should not be oh my gosh, I hope I get funded. Because what you need to know is that foundations like ours are thinking, oh my gosh, you're the ones doing the work. I hope we can partner. I hope we can find ways of supporting. I hope we can do whatever we can to lift you up, and because you're the ones doing the work. You all, especially for these types of foundations, you have so much power. Right? And I hope when you walk into a meeting with the Colorado Health Foundation or the Kansas Health Foundation, anybody on the border, by the way, we should work together, that you recognize that power, because it's real. Look, we are looking to you to help us advance the things that our board and our staffs are saying that we're supposed to be advancing. And we can't do it without you. We need you, and that means you have the power. We actually have a different level of power, and it's not the same as what you have, and we need your help.
I agree. Nonprofits cede way too much power to foundations.
So I have a ton of questions in my hand right now. and I am getting the look. So we will find a way to respond to all of the questions that we have received, and we will be communicating that out to you all during the course of the symposium. Please join me in thanking our panelists for talking a little bit about power and philanthropy, and if you have additional questions, please bring them to us. Next, we will be taking a break for about 15 minutes. I was looking for my cue. 15 minutes. Thank you all.